Hey everybody, thank you for watching Leaf by Leaf. This is the final part of the 2666 group read in collaboration with the Recognitions Book Club. As always, I will put all of the contact information for the Recognitions Book Club down below in the description. There is a corresponding post on the Instagram account for this final section, the part about Archimboldi. It will have a series of prompts that have been leading to really good discussion. For this video, I am going to assume that you have read all of 2666, that you've been reading along with us and have just finished this final part. But even if you haven't read this final section and you've read all the way through the part about the crimes, even some of the stuff I bring up that I could see being a spoiler isn't really a spoiler. Time in our reading, we kind of know what's going on. Two questions really stood out to me when I finished the previous part, the part about the crimes. And I actually had to take a couple of days in between reading before I was ready to pick it up again. But I thought to myself, where can Bolaño possibly go from here? After the enormous buildup of the first three parts and then the crushing force of the fourth part, where in the world do we go from here? And the other thing I thought about as I've been thinking with all of the everything in 2666 is what must be said before dying. And I'm thinking from the perspective of Bolaño in his final days there, as his body is shutting down and he knows that the end is approaching. What must be said? I'm thinking again of an earlier quote I brought up in a previous video in 2666 from Annie Dillard in her book, The Writing Life. She said, write as if you were dying. And she means dispense with everything unnecessary. Imagine Bolaño looking death in the eye, as it were, writing these words from this final part. The diseased, anyway, are more interesting than the healthy. The words of the diseased, even those who can manage only a murmur, carry more weight than those of the healthy. Then, too, all healthy people will in the future know disease. The sense of time, the diseased man's sense of time. What treasure hidden in a desert cave. Then, too, the diseased truly bite, whereas the healthy pretend to bite, but really only snap at the air. Then too, then too, then too. What beautiful and chilling words. And that image of a treasure hidden in a desert cave. Desert works on two levels here. Obviously, Juarez is in the middle of a desert, and Juarez, or Santa Teresa, is that physical center, as Echeverria tells us Bolaño saw 2666. But then also we have the prisoner, Klaus, and Archimboldi's younger sister, Lotta, with these visions of a giant coming across the desert. This section gives so much. It's daunting to even try to analyze it. I actually finished this book 4 days ago, but I'm only just now feeling ready to even start talking about it. I honestly think that this section alone has so much in it. You could apply almost any literary study of any form to this alone. Any literary theory that's out there, any archetype or trope that could possibly be brought into literary studies could be applied to this massive, deep section. So to go back to my first question when I finished the part about the crimes, where does Bolaño go from here? Well, he follows his narrative pattern of backing up in the timeline to before the previous part and then eventually meeting back up. But in this case, it's a little different because he backs up before all of the previous timelines. So up to now, each one has gone back just before its predecessor and then met back up and gone forward. This time it goes back, and in fact it goes back so far that it covers nearly a century. It starts from just before World War I with Archimboldi's father, and then goes all the way to 2001. When Archimboldi is getting ready to take his flight to Mexico. But then I've since found out that his close friend, Carmen Perez de Vega, affirmed that Bolaño wrote the part about Archimboldi first, and she further implies that Bolaño was working on the part about the crimes when he was forced to stop, and that he left that unfinished. So we can surmise that though 2666 remains unfinished, The part about Archimboldi is complete, and in fact was written first, even though it's placed at the end. And those remarks come from Ricardo Gutierrez Muat's book, Understanding Roberto Bolaño. So the question that I asked myself of where does Bolaño go from here doesn't really have steady footing because I didn't know those things yet. In my thinking, Bolaño had gone from the horrors of the femicides at Santa Teresa back to another historically true horror, that being World War II and the Holocaust. But in fact, he had already done that. And in a way, now I'm seeing that he was starting there and then making his connection linearly out to the femicides in Juarez. The plot is pretty simple, just like all the parts, but then it's the, bottom portion of the iceberg that we really get into when we start reading it. Essentially, it is the backstory of Hans Reiter, whom we've already been told about in, I believe it was the first part, the part about the critics, right? When they realized that someone named Hans Reiter had checked into a hotel, and we get some insight that this was a name that Archimboldi went as. And then of course we have Peltier and Espinosa feeling that Archimboldi is already there. We finally get to a point in this last section where the narrator, who by the way is Bolaño, not Bolaño, but Bolaño, this sort of semblance of Bolaño. Once we get to the portion of the origin of that assumed name, then the narrator goes with that. But how cool is it that we have this German phonetic homonym of Reiter on the name Hans Reiter. So I really don't think that's a spoiler. It's not so interesting that Archimboldi is Hans Reiter. We pretty much get that from the very first part, or at least the intimation of it, which ends up being true. But what's more interesting is how this figure is linked to the Santa Teresa femicides, and that we do get. And in true Latin American fiction style, it's linked into the family tree, the generational tree. But in short, we get the backstory of Archimboldi / Hans Reiter from just before his birth in 1920 to 2001 when he leaves for Mexico. And this takes us through his years as a soldier in World War II and his evolution as a writer. And like the previous sections, we eventually discover his fateful link to the femicides in Juarez. The narrative gets a lot more complex here. At one point we have these nested levels of narration and heavy exposition throughout. Stories proliferate, characters come and go, but we have Bolaño, the narrator, and then, if you really want to get crafty, we have Bolaño, the writer, Bolaño, the narrator, us, the reader. But anyway, at one point, we're down about 4 levels with Bolaño narrating, and then the story of Hans Reiter, who's then reading Ansky's notebook, and then the notebook is written about Ivanov, the writer. There are snippets of Bolaño all through here that we can compare back to his writings in between parentheses. I'll just name a few of them. For example, in 2666, it says of Hans Reiter that at age 6, he stole his first book. And in the article, Who Would Dare?, Bolaño writes, "The books that I remember best are the ones I stole in Mexico City between the ages of 16 and 19. On page 722 of this Picador paperback, we learn about Ivanov's fear as a writer. And again, this connects into a quote that I've been bringing in more over and over in these videos from Bolaño's Caracas address. So what is top-notch writing? The same thing it's always been. The ability to peer into the darkness, to leap into the void, to know that literature is basically a dangerous undertaking. The ability to sprint along the edge of the precipice, to one side the bottomless abyss, and to the other the faces you love, the smiling faces you love, and books and friends and food, and the ability to accept what you find, even though it may be heavier than the stones over the graves of all dead writers." From 2666, there's this portion that says, "I'm only 59. I won't be 60 for some time. And may I remind you that Cervantes wrote Don Quixote more or less at the same age I am now." And we know that Bolaño himself was 50 toward the end of writing 2666, and he too was a late blooming writer. In 2666, Hans Reiter at one point says, "What a relief to give up literature, to give up writing, and simply read." And in Bolaño's self-portrait, he says, "I'm much happier reading than writing." There's this great quote toward the end of the section that says, "Fame and literature were irreconcilable enemies." And this gets into all kinds of discussions. It links back earlier in the book to the pharmacist who always read the minor works of major novelists. And actually in this section, there's a lot of talk about the purpose of those minor works as contributing to the masterwork. But more and more in this section we see, and more in Bolaño's other writings, we see that he agrees with Cyril Connolly in the opening of his book, The Unquiet Grave, where he talks about how the only real purpose of writing is to produce a masterpiece. And Bolaño definitely suffered from what a lot of writers see, and that's that schism between what is popular and what is permanent. History becomes a very important preoccupation in this part. Like I said, we start just around World War I and end in 2001. A lot goes on there. World War II becomes the focus. The importance of history has already been implied by the narrative structure. Like I said, each part begins by backing up a little bit from the previous part. Almost as if Bolaño is saying, okay, before we can go any further, I need to give you history. You need history. And as Halder says, "I neglected my studies of history, which are also needed in order to hone both edges of the blade, so to speak." And from this, this may conjure up the scripture, Hebrews 4:12, where it talks about how the Word of God is sharper than any two-edged sword, cutting through bone and marrow. And what it's getting at, that sword, that's the Word of God, and that's truth. And so in this way, in order for us to reach the truth of something, we need both the artistic rendering and learning, which Halder has already linked to Goethe and Schiller among others, and the actual history. Semblances come up again and again throughout the whole book. We link back to the part about fate with Siemens' oratory. He talks about how metaphors are our way of losing ourselves in semblances, or treading water in a sea of seeming. In that sense, a metaphor is like a life jacket. And remember, there are life jackets that float and others that sink to the bottom like lead. And in the part about Archimboldi, we get semblance was an occupying force of reality, even the most extreme borderline reality. It lived in people's souls and in their actions, in willpower and in pain. It set the rules. So there's this urge in Bolaño to remove this life jacket of semblance and metaphor. Mirrors have come up again and again. Remember my thoughts on the chilling scene with Liz Norton and the double mirrors in her hotel room in Santa Teresa. And mirrors themselves are semblances. We could link this to Platonic forms and the Kantian dualism, where there's this world of things that we cannot reach, and where we live and what we see is just a shadow of what really is. And so Bolaño, he wants to shred those semblances and pierce through the veil to what is, but at the same time, there's this haunting sense that it may be nothing, that it may just be all the graves of all the dead writers. Again with semblance, Giuseppe Arcimboldo is a 16th century Italian artist best known for creating portraits out of objects. In other words, he's creating semblances. Similarly, Hans Reiter, he's taking a cue from the semblance creator, it's Arcimboldo, and he's creating his own semblance. Now he's the semblance of a writer. Let's talk about a couple of critical books I consulted and some pieces that were relevant to this section. Again, from the book Understanding Roberto Bolaño by Ricardo Gutierrez Moat. He says, for the most part, the figures of cult author and criminal approach each other only asymptotically in the novel, but at one point they come dangerously close to being one and the same. This happens in the passage where Klaus's grandmother confuses her grandson with her own son Hans, Klaus's uncle. This is, of course, revealed to us in this final part. This giant, which may derive from a fairy tale by Hans Christian Andersen, is none other than Archimboldi, who has killed a man and experienced the Holocaust of World War II. which is why he is covered in blood from head to toe in this vision. Throughout the novel, it seems that the second coming is at hand or has already arrived, but Bolaño never elucidates the identity of author and criminal. The former disappears behind his work, the latter behind his crimes. And to tack on, in the book Roberto Bolaño's Fiction, An Expanding Universe by Chris Andrews, he says, in Bolaño's fiction, the accomplice, the dictator, the sociopath, and the administrator are distinct types and are treated in contrasting ways. By exposing these interrelations and showing how normal human desires and fears can lead people to participate in atrocities, Bolaño's fiction anatomizes evil and advances toward a post-theological understanding of its causes. But this movement is limited by two factors, one diegetic and the other discursive. The diegetic factor, internal to Bolaño's fictional universe, is the urgency of preventing further evils, people trying to do something. Think about Oscar Fate and Rosa Amalfitano. Think about Hans Reiter and Zeller/Sammer. The second factor that limits the understanding of evil is discursive. Getting to the bottom of it would diminish the unresolved suspense that is a hallmark of Bolaño's storytelling and would work against his method of using gaps in earlier texts to stimulate ongoing invention. And speaking of Zeller/Sammer's story, this was one of the highlights of some of the various discursive expositions that come up all throughout this part. But the story that this guy tells and the way he attempts to justify his actions is chilling. And Chris Andrews actually links him with Hannah Arendt's portrayal of Adolf Eichmann. Andrews says he, meaning Sammer, engages in a mental maneuver perfected by Himmler and analyzed by Hannah Arendt. The trick consists of directing the spontaneous pity normally felt in the presence of physical suffering toward the self, so that instead of saying, "What horrible things I did to people," the murderers would be able to say, "What horrible things I had to watch in the pursuance of my duties. How heavily the task weighed upon my shoulders." One question that I think is left very much open-ended is why Hans killed Sammer. But of course, this is the root of the whole elusive figure of the cult writer Archimboldi. Andrews says perhaps the bureaucrat is his type of evil person that's linked to Sammer. Perhaps the bureaucrat's belief that his guilt was mitigated by physical distance from the crimes that he organized provoked Reiter into getting his own hands dirty. And again, here we have another link to Klaus, who's imprisoned. And this was actually based on a real figure that was imprisoned and linked to the Juarez crimes, but yet they continued to happen. And so the authorities started to say, of course, like they do in 2666, that the person was organizing from within the prison, was organizing continued murders. And in the same way, we see that the bureaucrat tried to maintain his innocence by not being directly involved. To put this section, which was written first, at the end, makes this a very circular book. It would be much more linear all the way through if it had been first. But doing it this way and having Archimboldi leave for Mexico at the end almost makes it such that my first impulse was to go right back to the part about the critics and continue reading. And in fact, it ensures that a subsequent read will be very much fruitful to have all of this context. The circularity, therefore, is not as explicit as, say, Finnegan's Wake, but still circular nonetheless. To conclude, I'll quote from nearly the very last page, which talks about a book of Archimboldi's. The style was strange. The writing was clear and sometimes even transparent, but the way the stories followed one after another didn't lead anywhere. All that was left were the children, their parents, the animals, some neighbors, and in the end, all that was really left was nature. A nature that dissolved little by little in a boiling cauldron until it vanished completely. The way the stories followed, one after another, didn't lead anywhere.